it's 1505. And somewhere in the Caribbean, a system is being born that will reshape the world forever. Not through conquest, not through discovery, but through one man's decision to extract maximum wealth from the land he'd claimed. What happened in this moment would create an economic model that would define centuries of American history. By the end of this story, you'll understand why 1505 is arguably more important than 1492, and how the seeds of American prosperity were planted in exploitation. When Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, he brought back something more valuable than gold to the Spanish crown, proof that vast lands existed across the Atlantic, populated by people who possessed no iron weapons and no written language. The Spanish saw opportunity. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella saw colonies. But within 12 years of Columbus's first voyage, the initial optimism had faded. The gold wasn't flowing as promised. The colonies weren't self-sufficient. Something had to change, and quickly. By 1505, a new governor named Nicolas de Ovando had arrived in Hispaniola with clear instructions from the Spanish crown: make these colonies profitable. Ovando was a military man, accustomed to getting results. He understood one thing the early colonists had been slow to grasp. The indigenous population wasn't going to voluntarily provide the labor needed to extract wealth from these islands. The Spanish had tried incentives. They'd tried persuasion. Now they would try force. What Ovando instituted in 1505 wasn't slavery in the legal sense, at least not in the way Spain understood it. It was something called the Encomienda system, a term that would become synonymous with oppression. On paper, it looked reasonable. Spanish colonists would be granted groups of indigenous people, along with the responsibility to feed, shelter, and Christianize them. In exchange, these indigenous people would work. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary and humane. The reality would be something else entirely. This moment in 1505 marks the official beginning of organized forced labor in the Americas. It's the instant when colonization stopped being about exploration and started being about extraction. Here's what's remarkable. It wasn't done in secret or in shamet, was done openly, sanctioned by the crown and blessed by the church. The profits that would eventually fund Spain's Golden Age and later influence American economic development would flow directly from this decision. Understanding 1505 means understanding the foundation of colonial America itself. To understand what was lost when forced labor began, you need to know who the Taíno were. These weren't primitive people living in chaos. The Taíno civilization had existed for centuries, developing a sophisticated society across the Caribbean islands. They had complex social hierarchies, extensive trade networks, and a deep knowledge of agriculture that allowed them to thrive in their environment. They grew cassava, sweet potatoes, and corn. They fished with remarkable skill. They built homes designed for the tropical climate. By any reasonable measure, they had achieved a stable, functioning civilization. The Taíno had their own spiritual beliefs, their own languages, and their own governance systems. Different caciques, or chiefs, controlled different regions, and these leaders maintained complex relationships with one another. There were regular gatherings, sporting events played on specially prepared grounds, and a rich artistic tradition expressed through carvings and woven goods. Archaeological evidence shows that the Taíno population in 1492 may have numbered anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million people across the Caribbean islands, with the largest concentrations on Hispaniola where the Spanish colonies were being established. When Columbus first arrived, many Taíno responded with curiosity rather than hostility. They brought gifts of parrots and fruit. They helped the Spanish navigate. Some even boarded Columbus's ships willingly, seeing opportunity in trade and exchange. In the earliest accounts, Spanish observers noted the generosity of the Taíno people, their apparent gentleness, their eagerness to please. Columbus himself wrote admiringly of their lack of weapons and their apparent innocence. But this generosity was interpreted as weakness. The Spanish saw a people without iron, without horses, without the technology of European warfare, and concluded they must be inferior. They didn't recognize sophisticated agriculture as agriculture. They saw it as the casual abundance of nature. They mistook hospitality for submission. Within a decade, that initial curiosity had transformed into resentment and resistance as Spanish demands grew increasingly unreasonable. By Wu, the Taíno had experienced 13 years of Spanish presence. They'd learned that the Spanish were not gods, but men. They'd learned that these men valued gold above all things, and were willing to use violence to obtain it. Yet the historical record barely mentions indigenous resistance, and that silence itself is a kind of injustice. Because resistance did happen, but it was either suppressed so thoroughly we have few records, or simply ignored by Spanish chroniclers focused on other matters. The Taíno had witnessed forced relocations, watched their sacred spaces violated, and experienced Spanish weapons being used against those who resisted. The Encomienda system that Ovando introduced would transform the nature of Spanish indigenous relations from tenuous coexistence into systematic subjugation. Everything the Taíno had built was about to be systematically dismantled. The Encomienda system was brilliant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. Here's how it worked. A Spanish colonist would receive a grant from the governor, giving him dominion over a specific group of indigenous people, typically numbering from dozens to hundreds depending on the size of his land grant. The colonist, called an encomendero, was technically not a slave owner. The indigenous people, called encomendados, were technically not slaves. They were, according to Spanish law, free subjects of the crown. But in practice, this distinction meant almost nothing. Each encomendero was responsible for Christianizing and civilizing his encomendados. They would provide them with food and shelter, though typically minimal, and expose them to Catholic teaching and Spanish culture. In exchange, they could demand work, lots of work. The indigenous people could be required to labor in fields, in mines, in construction projects, or on other enterprises that the encomendero deemed profitable. The system included no established limit on working hours, no guaranteed time off, no compensation beyond subsistence, and no legal protection against abuse. What made the encomienda particularly insidious was its appearance of legitimacy. It wasn't slavery, at least, not in name. The Spanish crown could justify it as a Christian mission, a way to bring civilization and salvation to heathen peoples. The Catholic Church, which could have objected to the exploitation, instead blessed the arrangement. Some church leaders saw it as a practical necessity for colonial survival. Others saw it as an opportunity to access indigenous souls for conversion. The moral objections that should have immediately surfaced instead were muted. The system also created a unique economic incentive structure. An encomendero's wealth was directly proportional to how much labor he could extract from his encomendados. There was no incentive to treat workers well, to limit their work, or to preserve their health. In fact, the incentives ran precisely opposite tanned. Here's the chilling part. If an encomendero worked his workers to death, he simply requested more replacements, and he usually got them. If a worker died, the encomendero would petition for more indigenous people to be assigned to him. The system assumed an inexhaustible supply of labor. As long as there were indigenous people, the system could continue extracting value. By 1505, Ovando had already begun implementing this system, and it spread rapidly. Spanish colonists, who'd initially come seeking quick gold, began settling into a longer-term extractive enterprise. They established estates in the interior of Hispaniola, creating mini-kingdoms where they held absolute power over their income. The colonists built homes, planted crops, and expanded their operations with the absolute confidence that neither the Spanish crown nor the church would significantly interfere with their methods. They were, after all, extending Christian civilization and Spanish dominion. What was happening to the indigenous people was incidental to that larger mission. Understanding the Encomienda system, in theory, tells you very little about what it meant for the people subjected to it. The reality was unimaginably harsh. Imagine being required to work from sunrise to sunset, 6 or 7 days a week, with perhaps one day designated for growing your own food. Imagine that your children were eligible for work around age 8 or 9. Imagine that if you became sick or injured, your only option was to keep working or starve, because the encomendero's obligation to feed you was minimal at best. The work itself was backbreaking. Mining for gold, which was the primary focus in the early colonial period, required digging in dangerous conditions with primitive tools. Indigenous people were sent into mines where cave-ins were common, where injury was constant, and where diseases like dysentery and malaria spread rapidly. Agricultural labor was slightly less dangerous, but equally exhausting. Clearing land, planting crops, and harvesting under the tropical sun left workers malnourished and vulnerable to disease. The food situation deserves special attention. Encomenderos were theoretically obligated to feed their workers, but they minimized costs ruthlessly. The diet was typically cassava bread, sometimes supplemented with dried fish or vegetables. It was often insufficient to sustain people doing heavy physical labor. Workers became chronically malnourished. When malnutrition combines with overwork, disease becomes inevitably. Yet continued the system anyway because it was profitable. Tuberculosis, dysentery, influenza, and smallpox, the latter introduced by the Spanish, began circulating through indigenous communities with devastating effect. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The Taíno people went from relative autonomy and self-determination to a system where they controlled virtually nothing in their lives. Their time wasn't theirs. Their labor wasn't compensated. Their traditional ways were actively suppressed in favor of Spanish and Christian culture. Children were sometimes separated from parents, assigned to different encomenderos, or sent to Spanish settlements for education. The social structures that had sustained Taíno society for centuries were systematically dismantled. Additionally, the encomendero system disrupted indigenous agriculture and trade. Rather than growing the crops that naturally sustained them, indigenous people were forced to grow crops for Spanish profit or Spanish consumption. Hunting and fishing, which had been important parts of the Taíno diet, were restricted. Access to traditional gathering grounds was curtailed. The traditional economy collapsed, and people became entirely dependent on what their encomendero chose to provide. Resistance was futile. Those who fled were hunted down. Those who disobeyed faced punishment ranging from whipping to execution. Within just a few years of the Encomienda's implementation, Spanish colonists realized they had a problem. The indigenous population was dying, not just from overwork and mistreatment, though those were certainly factors, but primarily from disease. Smallpox, which the Spanish had introduced, spread through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed. The Taíno had no immunity to European diseases. Estimates suggest that the indigenous population of Hispaniola, perhaps numbering around 300,000 in 1492, had declined to around 30,000 by 1510. By 1540, fewer than 500 remained, what historians now recognize as one of history's greatest genocides, though most of it was caused by disease rather than direct violence, which somehow makes the indifference to their suffering even more difficult to comprehend. It was demographic collapse of staggering proportions. This collapse created an unexpected problem for the Spanish crown and the encomenderos. The encomienda system depended on a large, available population of indigenous workers. As that population disappeared, the system became unsustainable. More importantly, the diminishing labor force meant less wealth extraction, and the Spanish crown had come to depend on colonial profits. By 1510, colonial administrators were already writing to the crown expressing concern about the declining indigenous population and what it meant for colonial productivity. Some resistance did occur, though it was relatively limited. Individual encomendados fled into the interior of the islands, seeking refuge in remote areas. A few coordinated rebellions took place, but they were quickly and brutally suppressed by Spanish forces armed with superior military technology. One indigenous leader, named Hatui, a cacique from Hispaniola, fled to Cuba with his followers and attempted to organize resistance there, but he was eventually captured and executed. The Spanish were efficient at preventing organized indigenous resistance from succeeding. By 1520, the encomienda system had begun to evolve, but not because Spanish colonists had developed a conscience. It evolved because the indigenous population was becoming extinct. Desperate for continued labor, Spanish colonists and administrators looked elsewhere. This desperation would lead directly to the decision to import enslaved Africans, beginning around 1517. In a bitter irony, the attempt to exploit indigenous peoples would eventually lead to the creation of the transatlantic slave trade system of exploitation that would dwarf the encomienda in its scale and duration. The collapse of the Taíno civilization was one of history's greatest demographic catastrophes. What had been achieved in 1505, the systematic extraction of indigenous labor, would inadvertently trigger the larger mechanism that would define American colonial history for centuries. The Spanish had solved their labor problem, but not in the way they'd anticipated. Following the money in any historical system reveals what truly mattered to the people involved. In 1505, the Spanish crown cared about one thing: colonial revenue. The encomienda system delivered results, at least initially. Gold flowed from the Caribbean to Spanish ports. Spanish colonists grew wealthy beyond what they could have imagined in Spain. The crown extracted its share through various taxes and fees. For the first decade of the encomienda's existence, it appeared to be working exactly as intended. The wealth extracted was genuinely staggering. Gold from Hispaniola, some sources suggest, may have equaled 50 tons during peak production years in the early 1500s. In an era when gold was the foundation of economic power, this represented transformative wealth. That gold didn't just stay in the Caribbean, it flowed to Spain, where it funded military campaigns, naval expeditions, and construction projects. The gold from indigenous labor helped finance Spanish colonial expansion in Mexico, Central America, and South America. But the wealth didn't stop at Spain. Spanish merchants and traders, dealing with the products of the colonies, grew wealthy. Financial networks throughout Europe were affected. Banks in Italy and the Low Countries extended credit to Spanish ventures based on colonial profits. European merchants who'd never set foot in the Americas benefited from colonial wealth. The economic ripple effects were continental in scope. Additionally, the Encomienda created a specific social structure in the colonies. A small group of Spanish colonists, often numbering in the hundreds or low thousands, accumulated tremendous wealth and power by controlling the labor of indigenous peoples, numbering in the tens or hundreds of thousands. This created a colonial aristocracy, men who could translate colonial wealth into political power, land holdings, and social prestige. It established the model for colonial societies throughout the hemisphere, a small European elite extracting wealth from a much larger population of exploited workers. The financial incentive structure created by the Encomienda proved tremendously powerful. It incentivized migration to the colonies. It incentivized the development of colonial infrastructure. It incentivized, above all, the discovery and exploitation of new territories and new indigenous populations. When the indigenous population of Hispaniola became scarce, the system naturally looked for new territories. This incentive structure, born in 1505, would drive Spanish colonial expansion for centuries and help establish the pattern that European colonialism would follow throughout the world.